So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for the first of two webinars entitled Healthcare Beyond Carbon, exploring the decarbonisation journeys of healthcare systems around the world. Now, I'm hoping that some of you might have had the chance to download the white paper, perhaps have read it. But for those of you who haven't had that chance yet, please feel free to do so. A link will be put to you and sent after this webinar. I did mention there's also a second webinar, and that's going to be on the 23rd of May at 9 p.m. British Summer Time. So please feel free to join that. The expert panel today that I have with me, they'll introduce themselves shortly, are from Sweden, Australia, Hong Kong, South Africa, and the UK. So I'm Anisha Mayer. I'm the UK Head of Healthcare at WSP. What I'm going to do now is invite Patrik to introduce himself. Thank you.
My name is Patrik Holmquist, and I am a mechanical engineer working in Sweden at the Gothenburg office. My commitment is to create energy efficient buildings in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brenda.
Hi everyone, my name is Brenda Kingston. I'm a Director of Sustainability based here in Melbourne, Australia.
Excellent. And Kenneth.
Hi everyone, I'm Kenneth Li, stationing in Hong Kong office, and I'm the Executive Director taking care of MEP and also building sustainability design.
Thank you. Iphendule.
Hi, I'm Iphendule Ndzipho. I am a sustainability consultant based in Johannesburg, South Africa.
And Victor.
Hello everybody, my name is Victor Okpevba. I'm a director within WSP. I'm one of our national healthcare leads, and I lead the decarbonisation. I'm a decarbonisation lead for the NHS within the UK.
Brilliant, thank you. So what we wanted to do before we get started is to ask you a key question. So on your screen, you should now be able to see, hopefully on your dashboard, the poll in which it should be asking you whether or not, number one, where do you feel you or your clients that you're representing is on the healthcare decarbonisation journey? So perhaps you don't know where to start. Or secondly, you've got a strategy, but not a roadmap to deliver it. A roadmap perhaps is in place, but the implementation is a challenge. Or potentially you're actually got a project up and running and you've got that roadmap underway. And finally, you're actually starting to see the results of that particular project or projects. So feel free, I'll give you a few moments to fill that in, and that hopefully will help us when we come to the Q&A afterwards. Right, so we've got here probably actual level pegging, and that you've got a strategy but not a roadmap, or your roadmap's in place but implementation isn't yet happened. It's a bit of a challenge. So yeah, please feel free to put your questions in the questions box as well as we go through this webinar, because we definitely want to try and answer your questions. If we don't get to all of them today, we'll come back to each and every one of those questions after the webinar. Thank you. So you might be asking, why did we choose to do this white paper? And really there were two key areas. So I'm sure you're all well aware of the Paris Agreement and the fact that we're trying to limit global temperature to not above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And the COP28 that happened in December underlined that single global mission and introduced something called the global stocktake, which basically showed where everybody is on that decarbonisation journey to 2050. Closer to home, and what meant a lot, I suppose, personally to me, was speaking to one of our NHS clients in Scotland probably about a year and a half ago, and they said to me, we're not really sure about what's happening in the rest of the world, and we really would like to understand a bit more, and particularly interested in the Nordics. So I think today we've got perhaps some of the clients from Scotland on the call, and if you would like to address some of those questions to Patrik, who is from Sweden, please feel free to do so. So then I realised that we do a lot of healthcare across 9 key countries, and so we've got 5 of them here today, and the remaining 4 will be on the webinar on the 23rd of May. So we thought, how do we break down each of these, the paper, into its constituent parts? So firstly, what are governments doing? What policies are in place to further this decarbonisation mission. How's the economy faring? Because obviously we have to somehow fund these decarbonisation interventions. And what can industry do? So what can the private sector do? What innovations can be brought in that way to speed decarbonisation up? And finally, across these 9 countries, over the 6 continents, the environment is very different, from extreme weather conditions to perhaps a little bit more stable conditions. And so each will have its own challenges. So how can we support your, what sometimes can be challenging decision-making process? So this is one of the infographics taken from our paper, and it's really the key metrics for historically how you'd measure a successful healthcare system. So in the green, you can see percentage GDP and healthcare expenditure, which correlates directly to the healthcare expenditure per capita, which is shown in US dollars. So if you take the US, for example, at 18.8%, and at the largest expenditure of just under $12,000 per person, you'd expect that to correlate to the number of beds, but not so. That's 2.8 beds. But if you look across to Hong Kong, you've got 8.5% of healthcare expenditure percentage GDP, but actually quite a high number of 4.3 hospital beds per 1,000 population. Now, if we were to take this paper further forward, we would hope to include a decarbonisation metric set against each of these in the future. Then we looked at how we can, how healthcare contributes to national emissions. And so on the top left, you can see that you've got the South African population at 2.5% being a percentage of national emissions, and the US, remembering it is the size of a continent, at 6.7%. And that's actually really quite starkly exemplified here on the right-hand side. Initial sort of look at it, you'll think, well, greenhouse gas emissions, million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, Canada's the largest at 43.09. But not so. The big, large blue circle here is actually the US at 595.14. And that trend is, again, exemplified here on the bottom left with the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And the US is well ahead at 1.86 compared to South Africa at 0.29. So what energy sources do hospitals use? It's a question that I've got asked a few times. What we've done is divided it into 2 separate sections. So on the left-hand side, you can see heating and hot water, and the right-hand side, electricity. And then in the green, we've got primary, and on the right, in the blue, we've got backup. So we start with heating and hot water. The vast majority still are using gas-fired boilers. Now, we've got an exception to this with Sweden back in the 60s introducing a district heating system, which has its merits in that it can switch fuels more easily than those that rely on natural gas. You can also see that everybody has a reliance in one way, shape or form on diesel as backup. And the question is, well, why is that? Why do you use that as backup? Well, that really is an independent fuel that allows no reliance on the grid, for example, or any other sort of system that feeds into a hospital building. On the right-hand side, you've got electricity. Everybody is reliant on the grid. And again, you've got diesel. Now, you've got some exceptions here with the UK, US and Canada also using combined heat and power systems. Now, New Zealand, you can see here in terms of the grid, is absolutely leading the way in terms of its reliance on renewables. A whole mix of hydromarine, wind, geothermal, and bioenergy can be seen here. Now, if you're a healthcare estates director or hospital owner and you're thinking, well, actually, I'm doing all the interventions in the world here to try and decarbonise my healthcare estate, and yet I look, if I'd say in the US or Australia, and actually the grid is not decarbonised to any significant extent. It's still powered, for example, by dirty brown coal. Why on earth should I continue with what I'm doing? So it's not just small gains, because essentially you can get a double benefit. So whatever you're doing, by the same token, each and every one of these countries is moving towards trying to decarbonise its grid. So that will only affect a bigger change, a faster change for each country if we keep doing our bit for healthcare. And then it's important to think about just where our healthcare services are housed. Quite often, you get things like care of the elderly or diagnostics, elective, non-acute services in an acute hospital. And you might say, well, why does that really matter? Well, it doesn't so much, but on two counts it could do. So number one, it's probably best to deliver care where it is best received. And equally, if you've got all those healthcare services in an acute hospital, what you're doing is increasing the energy use intensity because you have to heat, cool a much larger building. So back in 2022, July, in the UK, it was England, shall I say, to be more precise, for example, there was the introduction of integrated care systems. And that indeed creates a portfolio approach, which is looking at exactly this point, amongst a lot of other things as well. Once you've identified that where your healthcare services ought to be, then you've really got to think about where you actually locate these buildings. So in England, for example, NHS England has got a database accessible only to the NHS, determining where flood risk zones are, for example. So clearly you don't want to store up problems for the future, and therefore you want to avoid those particular areas where possible. In Chile, by the same token, it luckily enjoys quite a lot of sunlight and therefore can utilize to good effect PV panels, and therefore it's very important that those healthcare buildings are positioned in such a way to maximize that sunlight. Now, what we've discovered through our US colleagues is that something what they call grid stewardship is really important. This is a campus scale opportunity. It could well be applied to England, as I mentioned, the integrated care systems. So a hospital historically would just be, using the energy sources I've identified earlier. But there is the possibility that a hospital could become a net exporter of energy. And it could also introduce something called a microgrid, which means that it creates some battery storage. It doesn't have to be reliant on the grid at all times. But if it does become a net exporter of energy, that means that it could then provide energy for neighbouring public sector buildings or just neighbouring assets, which means that it could also generate a commercial income stream for itself, which is probably a departure perhaps from its normal modus operandi. And just for a moment, if we were to think about where carbon is produced most, probably a number of us would say, well, it's the energy, and that's what we've talked about. So that's scopes 1 and 2, and you can see in the red that makes up just over 20%. Now, scope 3 is actually where we move the dial fastest, and I can't speak for the NHS, but I understand from the NHS that that is a key focus, and a lot of work is going on there at the moment. It might surprise some that in the purple, that materials is just over 50% of all carbon emissions. And when you think about materials, you might be thinking, actually, it's construction materials that make the biggest difference. But not so. If you think about things like gloves, disposables, they make up a huge amount, amongst other types of materials that go in and out of a hospital. And why so? Because obviously you have vast supply chains that also have a contribution to our carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And then we need to think about finance and how as an economy, are we going to get to 2050? And in England, for instance, it's actually 2040. So if we think about public-private partnerships, that's something that particularly in the UK, as well as in Canada, has been very heavily utilised. In the UK, we've got 150 private finance initiative hospitals, healthcare facilities coming back into public ownership into the NHS over the next 10 to 15 years. Now, we could wait until that end of the concession period in order to decarbonise, but that means there's quite a lot of work to do to get to that 2040 point to have decarbonised the estate. So what can we do now? How can we work collaboratively, both public and private sectors together, to make sure that we, instead of when it comes to a life cycle renewal period, that we don't just renew with another gas-fired boiler. Potentially we could look at some other renewable sources like an air source heat pump. Now, the NHS has introduced the net zero carbon building standard as of February 2023, and that's excellent. Conversely, in the States, we've got it's a voluntary system. So there's something called the Health Sector Climate Pledge. So about 160 systems have already signed up to this. And you might think one is better than the other, but I would argue the case that perhaps it's not, and that might be something for conversation in our Q&A. Because actually, as a free market economy, everybody's competing to try and get a slice of that pie, so they're trying to up the ante each and every time. And the fact that so many people have, or so many systems have already signed up to that pledge, is testament to that fact. And equally, the state in the US, it's a federal state. So there are different states that do different things, and they've got different approaches in terms of carrots and sticks. So you've got, in some, tax incentives and something called the Inflation Reduction Act, introducing funding programs to make sure that these decarbonisation initiatives are rolled out. But equally, there are sticks. So in New York, they've got a law, as well as in Washington state, whereby you need to meet a certain threshold in each of your new build buildings, and if you don't, then you will get penalised. So there are moves afoot and different ways in which to get each system to do what we need them to do in terms of decarbonisation. Now, without a shadow of a doubt, healthcare priorities come first and always will come first. However, they always, I suppose, historically thought to be diametrically opposed to decarbonisation. But is there a way in which they can work together? So what you see in front of you here is an example of what's happening in the States using computational fluid dynamics. Now, that's something that probably a number of us have heard in terms of high-rise buildings when we look at wind tunnelling. Now, this is looking at the airflow path of particulates, and this is obviously a theatre that you can see in front of you. What it tries to do is to remove stagnant particulates from the air, from areas that aren't utilised, and really focuses ventilation on where it needs to be in order to maximise infection control. What that also means is that from a ventilation perspective, this can have an advantageous effect on decarbonisation and energy use intensity. So as we look ahead to 2050, there are two key areas. Clearly, the paper, if you're able to read it, does focus on new build. We are not ignoring existing buildings at all. So if we take the new build first, it's really important that we take a long life, loose fit approach. Now, why so? Because hopefully these new hospitals are going to be net zero carbon. So operational carbon has been, is aligned with that 2050 mandate. But if we have a change of a clinical model, what we don't want to do is raise these buildings to the ground, because all that's going to do is increase the amount of embodied carbon. So that's incumbent upon the actual healthcare systems as well as the planning systems to make sure that is the case. And then for existing buildings, this portfolio-wide approach is really important. So in the NHS, for example, there's this focus now on core, flex and tail. So core would be buildings that are suitable today and for future healthcare models. Flex would be suitable for today, but needs a bit of an adjustment to cope with the future models. And then tail would be those that need to be potentially disposed of because they're not suitable even for current days clinical models. So when we started on this paper, we thought maybe actually we all thought the same way, we all measured everything in the same way. And this is an example of actual and target energy use intensities across our hospital portfolio that we are involved with. But not so. We realised very quickly that there is no common language between even the 9 countries, let alone all the other countries that we're not party to in terms of healthcare as much. And so going back to the top of the webinar where I said that as part of COP28, so actually September last year, there was the introduction of the global stock take. It would be amazing if we could introduce a global healthcare stock take, because what that would do is would have a common language, and it would identify where the gaps are for investment, because ultimately what we need and want to do is to level up each of the countries in our race to achieve our decarbonisation objective. So I think now we've got time for our panelists. So if I can invite our panelists back again. Great. So terms of our questions, we've got a few. How does your system finance decarbonisation? Brenda, interested to know what happens in Australia.
Oh, thank you. So in Australia, our state departments are set up per state and territory. So we have many of them and they take different approaches, not only within that state or territory, but those departments might even vary their approach to financing decarbonisation on a project by project basis. So in the best of examples, we see very clear sustainability briefs and minimum requirements, including decarbonisation metrics. And in terms of the budget allocation, they can sometimes be separable budgets specifically for sustainability, but other times built into the overall project budget.
Mm-hmm.
At the other extreme, we do still see examples where there's nothing briefed, so nothing in terms of minimum sustainability outside of the National Construction Code, and certainly no separate budget for decarbonisation.
Okay, all right. Is that reflective, Patrik, of what's happening in Sweden, or is that slightly different?
No, it's quite the same, but in Sweden, each health department has its own budget and strategy to reach the set climate goals. And depending on the project, the different health department can decide whatever they should provide a sustainability budget, for example, installation PV panels. And another way we talk a lot of in Sweden is also about how we can finance the decarbonization in the future, and it is to reduce energy use in existing buildings and build energy efficiently. Then the cost for the operational will go down for the future, and then we can have more money to invest in this subject.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Victor, for the UK, I appreciate we've got 4 different nations.
Hi everybody. So in the UK, there are 3 primary sources for funding for decarbonisation. I suppose I'm speaking specifically to England rather than Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, because the way it's done is slightly different in each region. So we have targets set centrally. So the NHS England has targets set for decarbonisation by 2032, 2040, 2050, and a journey of where we should be on that timeline. In terms of financing, new build projects and large-scale refurbishments are subject to what Anisha mentioned earlier, which is the NHS Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. This embeds zero carbon requirements into the business case approval process for medium to large projects. To achieve business case approval, the design of the projects must follow the processes outlined in the standard, and by doing so, they should deliver the operational and embodied carbon objectives which align with the overall NHS ambition to decarbonise. We also have individual trusts who are assigned capital budgets on an annual basis, and that budget covers all of the capital works that they've got to do, whether it's buildings, refurbishments. Some trusts have the ability to assign some of this funding to sustainable initiatives across their estate. What we do tend to find is that they address the high impact projects, which have a low kind of capital funding requirement, so kind of what we would call low hanging fruit. And lastly, there are a number of public funding initiatives with finance provided by central and regional government. The largest of which is called SALIX, which is an arm's length body, which is part of the Department for Energy and Security. The scheme provides funding for strategy and project work, which ranges from £10,000, or let's talk US dollars, $10,000 up to 30 million US dollars. One thing to note is access to the funding is competitive and it's open to any public sector organisation, so that's schools, hospitals, government-owned commercial properties, local government. So it's a challenge to achieve successful funding.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, hopefully in time, with all the 150 PFIs, there might be a way that we can try and finance those too, as we go towards 2036 when the majority get handed over. Okay, so Kenneth,
In Hong Kong, there is no specific budget, say for financing on a particular hospital for both government or private hospital. But in Hong Kong, actually, we need to comply with the building energy codes, which actually drives the necessity of providing a certain level of sustainability measures. So the project team need to comply with the code. So it is that at the project level, we have to reserve certain budget in order that the code can be complied. And also, in terms of the financing, there's also in Hong Kong, we have the Hong Kong Quality Assurance Agency to provide a third-party certification for some green financing product service or on organization levels. And we also have the Hong Kong Monetary Authority on supporting the climate and green finance initiatives, as well as the Green Bond Grant Scheme. So this can help, I think, on the project level, a certain level of financing. And the Hong Kong Stock Exchange also need to introduce for the listed company to publish the ESG report. So this will encourage the companies, in particular when they need to develop a private hospital, to disclose their environmental impact and sustainability practices. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Iphendule.
Well, in South Africa, there is no dedicated decarbonisation budget. But given South Africa has an energy supply crisis, the government has been pushed to consider independent power producers, IPP, to supplement the grid supply of energy. The obligation being they only produce renewable energy, which is a great opportunity for solar and wind power production. And it is important to note, previously the government had capped the amount of renewable energy that can be produced by IPP or independent power producers. This is great progress, as it would allow facilities to produce renewable energy according to their needs. It's also worthwhile noting that the production of renewable energy requires, or equally requires, energy storage systems are put in place. This, in turn, has encouraged a drive for smart battery energy storage systems, BESS or BESS. And finally, to maximize the decarbonisation of healthcare facilities, a starting point is to reduce their dependence on the grid. We can then say, in the context of South Africa, our response to crisis is yielding sustainable innovation.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Yeah, from all your responses, you wonder as well whether there are some pan-country organisations, when we think about the global healthcare stocktake potential, whether or not we can identify gaps in investment and therefore countries come together to help fund, like we would see through the EU, for example. Okay, thank you. So, is there a conflict between designing for healing and decarbonisation? Patrik.
It depends. Different care facility requires different solutions. For instance, functionality and cleanliness requirements apply to an operating and intensive care department. For a normal care department, it is important to have healing environment, and then the architecture has a greater importance. There are studies that show that a home-like environment speeds up the healing process, and also by using wood as a building material for floors and walls, you will speed up the healing process. Another positive effect by using more wood is instead of concrete is that you do not build in so much embodied carbon. And of course, as I said before here, like if you are less days at the hospital, it means that the patient can leave the hospital earlier, and that we don't need so much energy in the end to how to say this, to heal the patient. It's not the right word, but yeah, You understand?
No, I do understand, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting point, the utilisation of wood. Depends, I guess, on the extreme of the weather conditions, and whether that can be utilised in every part of the world. Iphendule, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, just to bounce off what Patrik says, it is often regarded that patients having access to natural external views is good for their wellness and or healing progress. Rather, it speeds up the progress. And often an architectural response to this is to maximize views by designing glazed openings that run from floor to ceiling, stretching along most of the facade. And, you know, whilst this can be aesthetically pleasing, this will actually increase the cooling and heating load on any healthcare facility or any building for that matter. And the rationale to this idea of conflict is that during the hot season, floor-to-ceiling glazing will allow in a lot more heat than a smaller glazing opening would, meaning the building's mechanical system or the HVAC system is required to work more, meaning it uses more energy to cool down the facility. And during the cold season, the opposite happens. The glazing will allow in a lot more cooler air, meaning the mechanical systems will need to work will need to use more energy to heat up the facility. And this action is actually quite carbon intensive. And a good balance to the above design conflicts, or rather to mitigate the above design conflicts, a good balance is to reduce the wall-to-wall ratio, window-to-wall ratio, to about 20% on a facade, on each facade. And this is actually also just a good example of passive design, you know.
Brilliant, got that. So I think that was one of the projects that you did in Ethiopia, which has exemplified that point too, and I think it's in the paper.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. How do you encourage behavioural change to ensure strategies and standards for decarbonisation, Kenneth, in Hong Kong?
Behavior change actually is essential to ensure the successful implementation on decarbonization. And I can say behavior change is the software elements, and while all sorts of implementation hardware, they are hardware, and behavior is software. So by behavior change, actually, this involves the leadership commitment and also the advocacy. And the healthcare leader, say for example, for a hospital, the top guy actually must demonstrate the commitment to decarbonization and set an example by adopting some eco-friendly practices within the healthcare facilities. And on the other hand, apart from the leader, we also have all the healthcare staff. They have to be well educated and trained on the importance of all these decarbonization measures. And also they need to be aware of all this and have their arouse their interest to adopt all these practices. So all these, I think these are very important for to create a culture within the healthcare facilities. And in addition, also if the staff or team who can achieve a certain target in the energy saving, they should be rewarded as incentives for ongoing motives on practicing all these energy saving actions.
Great, yeah, thank you. So definitely a tricky one, but one that I think Hong Kong's doing quite well at. That's my understanding at the moment. Can I encourage everybody to put some questions in the question box, particularly if you've got any related to back to that poll earlier in terms of having a strategy but not necessarily a roadmap to deliver, or you've got a roadmap but not sure how to get projects up and running. More than happy to take those questions and any others that you might have. So this is one that I get asked quite often, actually. How do different systems approach infection control from how they heat their water? Now, my understanding in Australia, it's been done, been broached quite a lot. So I'm going to ask Brenda how that's done.
Yeah, sure. I think the reason this question gets raised is a concern that all electric solutions cannot mitigate infection control. So the method we use in controlling infection in Australia is the same for what was a traditional gas-fueled system and an electric system. So for open heat systems like domestic hot water, which is the primary risk, we have proven and readily available electric heat pumps on the market, and they can heat and maintain the water at between 65 and 70 degrees Celsius, which is at that safe temperature. And so when you're generating at that temperature, you can recirculate your hot water so it's maintained between 60 and 65. And we also, so in addition to just maintaining those temperatures, we also minimize Legionella risk through the reduction in dead legs. And we do that by using thermostatic mixing valves with thermal flush assist. And we locate these close to the point of use. So again, so that we don't have those dead legs where Legionella could thrive.
Okay, that's Victor. How does that work in the UK?
We're very similar in our kind of traditional approach to Australia. So gas-fired boilers or central heat and power units providing water, providing heat to heat the water to a temperature that kind of provides pasteurization. And similarly, in terms of the way forward, we have this access to the same technologies in terms of heat pumps, high temperature heat pumps, and low temperature heat pumps alongside measures to increase the water temperature. We also have a few NHS trusts who have got large estates who have utilised copper silver ionisation. There is a kind of a challenge around using it. The benefits are that we can run the systems at a lower temperature, which makes the systems more energy efficient. You tend to find where trusts are doing things like that is because there's a particular pressure or a particular reason why they have to do it, a reason why they have to innovate. And our standards in our country are recommendations. And although it is quite challenging for people to move away from the standards, you can do as long as you plan correctly how you're going to install the system and maintain it over a long period of time and undertake the correct approval. So it's not impossible to use innovative solutions, but it is challenging around the long-term situation.
Yeah, sometimes case studies are quite useful, particularly when discussing this with authorising engineers. I mean, we've got a question as well that's come through, which talks about generally presentations, and ours included, overlook steam production for sterilisation, laundry services, heating when considering energy. Just wondered why. Victor, I think I'll address it to you if that's all right.
Yeah, so steam is a pretty common in the UK. I don't know a percentage, but a lot of the NHS trusts utilise steam to distribute heat around their estates. We don't generally have the single big building hospitals that some other countries do, such as the States, for example. We kind of have an estate which might have 20, 30, 40 buildings on it over quite a big site, and steam is used. It has been traditionally used to distribute heat to all of these different buildings. So one of the challenges with decarbonising our estate is that steam is very inefficient. There are lots of losses around steam systems, and it's very challenging, if not nigh impossible, to convert a steam system to an electric system, but so producing steam with electricity. So the approach we have kind of taken is to limit the steam requirements directly to the parts of the hospital that need it. An example of this would be a sterile services department where they do need really hot water, need steam to undertake the sterilisation of surgical instruments. And we look at electric steam generation in those locations, for example. So that's the way we've approached it in England, UK.
So Brenda, in terms of CSSD, that wouldn't necessarily be steam in terms of sterilisation departments. Is that right?
In Australia, for a long time, it's been electric generated steam for sterilisation. So same as you're now adopting for the UK's. We have had gas-fueled steam in some hospitals, but for a long time that they've been phased out.
Okay, fair enough. And what's anybody else, Patrik? Obviously, it's imagine very different for sterilisation.
No, it's the same in Sweden as Brenda said. We used to have steam, but nowadays it's electrical.
Yeah, fine. Okay, so in terms of other questions that we have, to make real progress on Scope 3, do suppliers need to start publishing carbon footprints for their individual products? Interesting question, and something I think here in the NHS are trying to tackle. We've certainly got our evergreen assessment. That's not mandated yet, but it is voluntary. But certainly suppliers need to be completing that. In terms of, I'm just wondering whether Scope 3 emissions, just generally, because we've got another one on this, in terms of examples, may be easier for public sector organisations that are driving healthcare to do potentially than industry at this moment in time. Is that fair to say? So people have got views on that.
I would say so, yes. If we can't, I don't think we can control it. So if as a public sector you are mandating a requirement, and you would perhaps send signals and timeframes out so that there's time to adapt, then ultimately the reporting can occur, and then informed decisions can be made. But it's not something that industry will do on their own, I don't think.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Okay, so in terms of circularity, this comes up quite often. Are there examples of where your healthcare system has actually embraced this? So I'll ask Sweden, so Patrik, perhaps.
Could you take it again, Anisha?
So in terms of circularity and how you've managed to embrace circularity, is that something that you've seen in the Swedish healthcare system?
Yes, in Sweden we're talking a lot of this now, and I'm working at a project at the moment where we do that. Actually, we reusing material. So let's see, I say, but the main issue seems to be how we can get the contractors on the same track, because their business in Sweden is that they have a percentage of all the material they buy. So they have a percentage. So that is a little bit of their profit. But anyhow, the materials we reuse today is the door sections, interior walls, suspended ceilings, and acoustic panels, cable ladders, light fixtures, door automation things, toilets, facade and roof tiles. And of course, on the outdoor environment, we use the stones, the curbs, bike racks, plants, and so on. And some material we are looking into now is the stone floors, installations on pipes, and also in walls, of course, and frame, if it's possible to use or not. And of course, for the mechanical part, it's like all the pipes for the heating, covering, and domestic water. And also for the ventilation part, it's ducts, but it's only passive products, so it's no fans or something like that. So it's and also the different devices. So we're already starting at this moment now, and I think within 5 years it will be a main issue in every project we have.
Indeed, yeah, because I mean, for us in the UK, and I'll Victor in a minute, it's just in terms of demolishing quite, potential larger hospitals, as we've got our new hospital program projects coming on board, is what do we do with what is demolished? Is that the ownership of the demolition contractor, or are we actually making sure that that's going back into the circular economy?
Yeah.
Victor.
Yeah, and one big question is also like, if there is a big hospital that now going to demolish a big building, it is like, where are we going to store all the different materials and products? So like that, some questions we are talking to around and see how can we find a solution on this one.
And also, where can we learn from other sectors potentially as well?
Yes, that's right.
And if you think of, I mean, this might be another conversation for another day, but if you think about data centers and the size that is now going to be required as we expand into this digital era, what do you do with the heat that is going to be offset, emitted by these massive, great big data centers? Victor.
Hi all. So I suppose there's a couple of angles to come at this from. One of the things is we have a kind of focus on embodied and whole life carbon in the NHS now, and as part of our business case process, you have to demonstrate the impact of your project. Let's assume it's a new build hospital, and its embodied carbon impact. So if you're replacing a building of another one, you do have to consider the impact on the whole life carbon. And what that does do is kind of stress the requirement to really look at potentially retaining some of this existing estate, reusing it, and refurbishing it. And if some of the challenges around change of use can be addressed and decant, so you can actually access the space to address it. There's a strong push to retain estate and reuse it, as long as the buildings are appropriate and suitable. There are, in terms of construction generally, there are some things that are done generally, more as part of the civil and structural piece around retaining basements or reutilizing, making up ground with materials that are already there on site, crushing concrete and reusing it. And then there's maybe the lower grade stuff of recycling, which is circularity in a sense, but not necessarily reusing the products, because energy has to be used to recycle the project, and energy has to be used to make it into another product. So that's I suppose where we are in the UK.
Useful to know. Okay, so we have another question, which is scopes 1, 2, and 3 data is so important to drive changes, yet so many healthcare organisations are using spreadsheets to collect and submit data, which just leads to data being inaccurate. What do each of the countries mandate for data collection? So I think this question has come from the UK, so I'm going to ask others. I don't know who wants to take this one first. Brenda, do you know what happens in terms of data collection?
Yeah, I don't know whether there's an Excel spreadsheet involved in each of the various state departments. There could be, but I'm imagining they do have a variety of systems and will differ for the different scopes, perhaps even. What we are seeing, though, it's related to this topic, is that about 4 years ago, a tool for measuring and benchmarking energy and water performance for hospitals was created in Australia, so the Neighbours for Hospitals tool. And what that does is provide star ratings on the performance of a hospital for energy and separately for water every year. So it's based on real data. And so there are 3 states that have been participating voluntarily and using that tool for just over 3 years now, and one of them for the first time actually published their results publicly, which was really pleasing. And what I think is interesting about that is not only are they looking at that data and benchmarking internally and using it for decision making, but I'm really hopeful that once you start publishing, there's also Australians are quite competitive people. I think there can become this real drive to perform better and to outperform your peers and to work harder. So doesn't quite answer the question, but just as an example of what we're doing.
I think that's really important as well, because I mean, Neighbours is something that we know and is a benchmark in the UK as well. So it's back to that point of it being a common language. So if there is one, that's sort of the start of a potential standard that gets exported. So it's an important point. Kenneth, in Hong Kong, do you know how data is collected? How data is collected for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions?
Yeah, in Hong Kong, we need to do the energy audit for the buildings actually every 10 years. So when we work on the energy audit services, we have to collect the energy tariff data for the past few years. I think whether we use a spreadsheet or not is just a tools or means. So what's important is the data itself. So usually we will collect the data from the operators, and they will keep track the data for the buildings, either by manual log. Some of the old buildings actually they don't have the BMS system. Then it will be simply a manual logging, or just a manual collection of the electricity bill, water bill, etc. And for some more new building, actually, they will be presented in the BMS, so that may be more accurate, as there are trend logging data, so we can keep track of the building in a more meaningful way. So usually we will keep track of 3 years data, and then we will work on the benchmarking against a similar building type, so to see if the building being audited is within the range or not. So then we will further propose some other energy management opportunity measures in the energy report, and for further follow-up actions by the owner. Yeah.
Okay, that's useful to know. So another question that's come through is, how is operational waste being considered in day-to-day operations? So recyclability of materials, non-composite products, natural-based materials, avoidance of disposable at landfill, hazardous or normal, and reduction of packaging. I don't know, Iphendule, Patrik, perhaps.
Sorry, I don't have any answer on this one. It's out of my scope.
That's all right.
This is equally almost out of my scope, but I'll give like some background and just start off saying, as my understanding is, because there's almost no obligation at a legislative level as to where the waste goes. There's no, as it stands, I just don't have knowledge of how, other than separating hazardous waste but like post the internal separation, if a healthcare facility does not choose to do it, or I imagine, or not imagine rather, the waste most likely ends at landfill.
Mm-hmm. Right, I see what
because
you're saying.
And I answer like this because, per my understanding, there's no obligation at a legislative level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. So, and in terms of extreme weather events, is there anything that's not each country's got extreme weather events, granted. So I suppose I'm looking to Australia and how you've dealt with that, forest fires, etc. That's
sure.
ravaged.
Yeah, just like everywhere else, we do have extremes, and in Australia we have tropical areas with cyclones, storm surges, we have flooding, bushfires, all the things. And a lot of our existing hospitals are vulnerable to those climate events or weather events, and we've seen quite a number be subject to flooding, extreme heat, and smoke ingress through bushfires. What we have done, so a bit over a decade ago, we had a very significant bushfire, and since then the National Building Code was updated, and so now we do have design interventions for preservation of buildings. So that's not just healthcare, that's all buildings. We also now design for future climates in terms of temperatures and drainage, flooding and wind as well. In one of our projects in northern Queensland, so northern Queensland is closer to the equator, and we do have many cyclones and extreme winds up that way. So one of the projects, and I won't name the hospital, but in this particular city, they had a hospital that is very close to the sea and was subject to significant impacts during climate events. And so a new hospital was built in a location that was not subject to flooding. And that building was designed with incredible resilience. So it was designed to what we call importance level 4. It included initiatives like ducted air to the air-cooled chiller, protective barriers to protect any plant that were outside the building. Obviously, the building envelope was designed for the extreme wind pressures as well. But in addition to that, there are diesel generators to operate the hospital in island mode during a severe event, and sufficient water and wastewater storage for 4 days. So really just going to that next level where the risks are high enough and the need for a healthcare facility to operate in those conditions. Obviously being very important. We've also seen spaces that can be repurposed from a meeting room to a clinical space, from a dialysis room to an emergency department. So we have those sorts of design interventions as well. And the last couple of projects that I've been involved with, we've been also looking at air quality during bushfires. So in the summer of 2019, 2020, we had, again, significant bushfires and smoke, very heavy smoke in our capital cities for close to a month. And so as a mitigation to that and other risks, we're seeing activated carbon filters as a design solution, either in a bypass mode or physically installed in reaction to an event. So yes, lots happening there.
Huge amount happening. And I think for anybody on the call who's interested in this, on the 23rd of May in the next webinar, we're going to have Chile, New Zealand, as well as the US and Canada, who also will experience quite a number of extreme weather events. So yeah, please tune into that if you're interested. So I'm going to thank the panel very much for all that input and in terms of really good responses to the questions that have been posed by our audience today. In terms of some of the key takeaways, I guess, I mean, what we talked about in terms of this global healthcare stocktake will be really important. I think probably what we've underlined as well is there is no common language between each of the countries at the moment, so it's kind of difficult to ascertain where there is you know, how we can meet some of those demands and requirements and where the gaps in investment are currently, and whether there is a sort of pan perhaps territory response with different trade associations, as I said, the likes of the EU, etc., potentially coming together. In terms of circularity, that's going to be an ever-increasing important point, that we don't just look at our renewing of our hospitals and healthcare facilities, but it's actually what do we do with the waste product that comes out of it as well. And then behavioural change, and we did touch on scope 3. I'm well aware that potentially for industry there's a lot more that we could be doing, working together with our public sector colleagues, and particularly with behavioural change, you know, walking the walk and talking the talk. As I say, with the NHS, the evergreen assessment is one of the ways at the moment. It's one of the first steps, but there's a lot more to do than what we can sort of input into the future of this. The other thing I was going to mention is that, as I said at the beginning, please do feel free to download the white paper. We invite any feedback, and what we're going to also do at the end of this call is put a final question in the which will come at the end when you leave the webinar, as to what you think the future topic for us to investigate could be, ought to be, something that will help you move the dial, not just for decarbonisation, but for other areas that might be of interest that WSP can help you with. And with that, I'm going to thank all the panelists. I'm going to thank the audience for listening today, and please feel free to reach out to everybody on, hopefully you can see my screen now with the contacts on screen, but we will also send out the slide deck with this too. All right, thank you very much, and wherever you are in the world, please have a good day or good evening. All right, take care. Bye-bye.